Hello everyone, this is Putnam County historian Larry Tippin. We've been doing a series on early history in Putnam County, and today I'd like to share with you information on the first Putnam County Hospital. We'll be looking at some newspaper articles and other lengthy information. If you'd like to pause and read what we're doing, you can, depending on which browser you're using, what platform you're in, you should have a pause button like this or this that you can click and pause the recording. Or if we get ahead of you, you'd like to go back and read a little bit more, you can left click and drag it back, again, depending on which we're using, and you go back to a previous slide. In the early 1900s, a group of ladies, some of whom were wives of local doctors, decided that we should have a county hospital to serve the needs of all residents of the county. They initially organized as Putnam Hospital Association, as we see in this newspaper article from 1907. These ladies gathered and discussed, decided that it would be good to have a hospital so incidents such as accidents, sickness, and so forth, so on, so we can treat the patients with kindness and sympathy that you really can't necessarily get at a private doctor office or at home. So it was June 1907. But in April, we see the group had met in the assembly room at the new courthouse at 2:30 that afternoon. The courthouse was only 2 years old at the time. And the president, Mrs. David Mays, presided. They adopted the name the Putnam County Hospital Association from the previous name Putnam Hospital Association. And also, they decided they were not going to accept the offer, generous offer, from Dr. George Worth Bence, who had offered the use of his medical office for the new hospital. His medical office was a block and a half east of the courthouse, across the street north of what's now the Masonic Lodge, because they didn't think the building has enough capacity or is a good enough condition. They're thinking big. They want to do something big on a grand scale. At that meeting, they selected 25 captains. These captains then responsible for soliciting funds in their district. They're assigned a geographic district, so to speak, and you can see that throughout the county, you see Mrs. Ed Lynch, Mrs. Dr. Bence, Mrs. Dr. Alexander, Mrs. Charles Bull Bridges from the Cairo area in Fincastle, Mrs. Lewis Zering, Manhattan, and so forth and so on. If you want to pause and read all of it, feel free to do so. But it's a cross section of these ladies from throughout the county, not just in Greencastle. Go to the next slide. So the hospital movement's gathering force. They selected officers. We'll go to the next slide and show you the officers. Additional officers here. That Mrs. Silas Hayes, Mrs. Clinton Zering, and so forth, so on. So they added to the roster. In these newspapers, if you'd like to read the whole article, you can go to the Hoosier Chronicles. It's free and it's online. Just go to the search engine you like to use and type in Hoosier Chronicles or Hoosier State Chronicles. And if I've got the right date, unless I mistyped something, you can get the whole article. So now they're getting some fundraising efforts going. So they're having a rummage sale in the Central National Bank. And then they've got some generous donations, $11, $10, and $6. In 1907, that's not pocket change, that's a decent amount of money. Also, some of the fundraising is not exactly conventional. So here's a game, baseball game, played between the Masons, and the Red Men at McKean Field the next Friday. The Red Men have informed the Masons they're going to have a dark horse pitcher, or a ringer, I'm going to call it that, for the benefit of the hospital fund. And they noted that this phenom, or what they call him, the ringer, is under strict instructions to strike out all the batters he faces. Again, you could pause if you'd like to read the whole article. Going to the next slide. Now they filed incorporation papers, the Hospital Association has, with the Secretary of State. And they have 26 directors. We're going to look at those on the next slide. And again, if you want to read all of them, you can pause. Some of the same ladies we were talking about earlier, Mrs. Alexander Lockridge, Mrs. Dr. Hutchison, so forth and so on. But also now they've got some men, Ed Lynch, Vaughn, Broadstreet, O'Hare, significant people throughout the county. Yeah, I remember this was a dozen years before the women even had the right to vote. So they probably thought they should add some prestige and balance to the association by getting some noteworthy men. Again, you can pause if you'd like to read it. This is interesting. See, a real estate transfer to the County Hospital Association, some lots in Commercial Place. Commercial Place is, as you know, the east side of Greencastle. And we're not sure if this was by gift or if it was an investment. It's 1908. We're going to skip a few years and come back. So these lots that they had acquired are now going up for tax sale. They had not paid the taxes on them, and they're going to forfeit those to tax sale. Going back now to 1909. So it looks like they've secured a site, but we need to not get ahead of ourselves too much just yet. Lee Sinclair, West Baden, offered the association his property at the junction of Bloomington and Depot Streets on the south side of Greencastle, known as the Thomas Van Cleve home place. And at that same meeting, they elected officers for the ensuing year. Mrs. Mays, was reelected, and then they've got some new officers. And then a little bit later, now they're talking about purchasing a different property, a whole different property now, that might be the ideal location. They're saying that they're probably not going to take up the offer of Sinclair on his home place, maybe because he wanted it to be named the Sinclair Hospital. Maybe that was not really what they had in mind. Fundraising is continuing. Here's 1910. They're going to use, the hospital association has permission from the county commissioners to use the building for some more fundraising, maybe a rummage sale or something. Continuing. They're continuing with their fundraising efforts. Mrs. Mays is again reelected. Apparently they're very happy with the job she's doing, and they're watching their money grow. Now they have $1,300 in the bank. And again, that doesn't sound like a lot of money today, but in 1911, that was a really good chunk of change, but nowhere near enough to build a hospital. But they're working very hard. They're getting there. They continued the fundraising efforts for several more years. The bank account grew. But then in 1917, everything changed. A bill was prepared and presented for passage to the legislature by Andrew Durham, who was representing Putnam County at that time. The bill did successfully pass. A new law was enacted to provide for formal procedures for the voters of any county in the state to petition their commissioners, asking election be held to determine desire of the voters regarding the question of building a county hospital. Now, this bill was for any county hospital in the state of Indiana, but it's noteworthy that this law originated right here in Putnam County. This is the current Indiana code for county hospitals. The Indiana Code 16-22, mostly parts of it unchanged from the 1917 law, including this part, which is almost word for word the same. I don't think it's even been changed at all. It says the county commissioners shall desire buildings and estimated costs of a hospital, method to finance it, and then appointment of members of the board for a hospital. In other words, or to appoint a separate governing board for the new hospital. Continuing with this. In addition to that, again, this is the current law. This talks about the appointment of the governing board, and it refers specifically to the acts of 1917. Again, going back to the 1917 original law that started right here in Greencastle, saying that they're going to have a 4-member board appointed by the county commissioners, and they're going to have staggered terms, 1-year, 2-year, 3-year, and 4-year terms initially. And then after that, 4-year terms. That way they're going to be staggered going forward. Shortly after passage of this law, Dr. Gillespie had prepared and filed with the county commissioners a petition, which he had circulated, signed by himself and 524 other voters, asking that an election be called for purpose of construction of a new hospital in Putnam County, in or near Greencastle, because of its central location to all county residents. See the Greencastle Herald, August 5th, 1919. The commissioners have set a date for that election to be September 30th, Tuesday, September 30th, for the question of whether or not we're going to have a hospital and tax ourselves for that purpose. This is a special election. There's no other, nothing else on the ballot. This isn't during the regular election. They don't want to wait till 1920 for the regular election. So they're going to have a special ballot question to raise $75,000 for the purpose of a hospital. They say, go on if you'd like to pause and read it. They're badly in need of the hospital, and so forth and so on. Going to the next slide. On that election day, during the day, the reporter goes out and sees that the voting is going slow. Turnout's not that great. That by 8 o'clock, only 2 votes have been cast in the 4th Ward of Greencastle, for instance. Predicted the vote cast will be small, but virtually all who vote will be in favor of the hospital, or so they believe. And goes on, if you'd like to stop and read it. I'm going to go to the next slide. However, it was defeated. The overwhelming majority of the county's precincts, the outlying precincts, in other words, not Greencastle, but the other precincts, the rural precincts, voted it down. Let's look at some of the numbers. You can pause if you'd like. Only 985 were in favor and 1,305 against, lost by 320 votes. For example, of the 72 votes cast in Jackson North, which is extreme northeastern Putnam County, only one of the 72 votes was in favor. And then in Floyd South, which is north of Fillmore, only one of the 68 votes there was a yes vote. So it was defeated. But they were not going to let it go. The Hospital Association gathered petitions with enough signatures to try again in the 1920 election. 1920 election, of course, is going to be the general election in the fall of that year, so it won't be the only thing on the ballot. And then they canvassed the voters to determine what the issues were and why so many were not in favor. They were very surprised that this was voted down, and they didn't really know why. So many of those that they interviewed felt the hospital was an effort by the physicians to primarily benefit themselves. They felt that the Greencastle doctors were doing this to put money in their own pocket. And also those from far distances thought that they would have to go too far for just minimal benefit, so they felt, and they were just fine with doing their living, dying at home. And also, it was noted that there were many fine physicians in Rochdale, Russellville, Cloverdale, Putnamville, so forth, Manhattan. Many of these doctors had an office right in their home or had a separate office nearby. And most of the people from there felt that why are they going to go a great distance from Greencastle? Remember, 1920, it's not, the transportation not what it is now. So it would be quite a trip to go to Greencastle. And they felt they could do the same thing at the local doctor. And they felt that the tax rate would just simply not benefit enough to justify the costs. So therefore, a very strong, significant effort was made then persuade those against the new hospital. The tax rate would in fact be minimal and potential benefits could be great. So they selected a site and had architect drawings so people could actually see what the hospital would look like, and also educated people to the benefits, things you really can't do at your local doctor, just as an x-ray equipment. I was actually very surprised. They were talking x-ray equipment 1920. I didn't realize we had x-rays that far back in time. But you couldn't just do that at that time at the local office, but if you had your local doctor's office, but if you had a central hospital then, you could have that kind of equipment and that kind of benefit. So a board of trustees was selected of 4 men, 2 from Greencastle, 1 from Rochdale, 1 from Cloverdale. That way you could represent the entire county. And the northwest corner of Northwood was selected as the location. And the site was given by the Northwood Development Company for the new hospital. Preliminary drawings were drawn up and submitted to the newly appointed Board of Trustees of the Putnam County Hospital by the firm Boland and Sons of Indianapolis, the architects that drew up the plan for the hospital. And you see in August of 1920, the hospital board then is studying those preliminary plans drawn by the architect Boland, and hoping they can start work next spring, provided the voters approve this. Elections coming up now. We're getting close. This is just a few weeks before election time, and the newspaper at that time is thinking that the hospital sentiment is growing. Now that people are becoming familiar with it, they believe an overwhelming majority will be in favor of the project. A new petition then was filed with the county commissioners, basically to have this question put on the ballot of the November 2nd, 1920 election. Also, they noted that the rate was only 2 cents for each $100 of assessed valuation for a period of 10 years until the bonds would be paid off. Bonds would be issued for this. And then the proponents felt this should be minimal, 2 cents for $100. A home back then may have cost $10,000. So 2 cents on each 100 would be $2. I mean, how can you say you're not going to spend $2 for this hospital? Also pointed out that the other objection, the doctors themselves being behind the movement only so they could enhance their own business. The physicians stressed they only were representing the interests of the people of Putnam County and wanted to give them the best medical and surgical attention possible. Continuing on, the reporting the day after the election that indeed the hospital question did in fact carry. It was also noted that in those outlying townships, the ones farther from Greencastle, the vote was only 15 to 25% in favor, still overwhelmingly against, but enough in Greencastle City, Greencastle Township voted for it, and then it was adopted. So the hospital board now is more formally organized, and then they elected their own officers. So let's look at that in the next slide. Andrew Hanna of Greencastle was selected president of the board, and Hospital of Rochelle secretary. McCoy and William Krieg, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And then they drew lots to decide the length of terms. So apparently they put numbers in a hat, I guess. I don't know. So Hanna drew the 4-year term, and so forth, so on. Down to Hofstadter had the 1-year term. The board also invited the county attorney to the meeting to explain to them clearly the law under which the board was to operate. And then the county attorney, John James, told them that they should issue bonds in the amount of $95,000, not $75,000, because they would need enough to equip and furnish the building, not just the brick and mortar. And the bonds would be for 20 years at 5% interest. The bonds then could be taken up and paid by the county at any time after those 5 years. And then it was noted in that article the salary that the various board members were to receive. Continuing on, in August 1921, the county banks take up the hospital bonds. So in other words, the county banks buy the $95,000 of the hospital bonds in proportion to the assets of the banks. So the big banks had more and the smaller banks had less. And they sold all 95,000 of those bonds. So now that the question of constructing the hospital has been settled, there's still going to need to be some money to furnish and equip the rooms and wards. The patients then could be there in a comfortable manner and so forth, so on. So they still need to raise a little bit more money. In an example, this is the American Legion Auxiliary selling poppies. The proceeds to go toward award for disabled war heroes. The poppies are significant to soldiers who are lying in Flanders fields beneath a garden of poppies. If you're not familiar with that, Canadian officer and surgeon John McCrae, following a battle in 1917 during the Great War in Belgium, noted that his fellow soldiers were buried in the field of Flanders beneath rows of poppies. So he decided that he would write this very inspiring poem, one of the more significant odes in all of literature, and if you don't know it, you should. Not going to read the whole thing, but in Flanders field the poppies blow, beneath the crosses, row on row. That should ring a bell with you. It goes on and on. We shall not sleep, the poppies grow in Flanders fields. Pause if you'd like to read the whole thing. It's very, very heartwarming, bitterly sad at the same time. That's the significance of the poppies to benefit the war heroes of all wars and of all nations. So many groups are jumping in to equip or furnish a room or a ward, including the Red Men Lodge. So they're going to equip one room, notify the county commissioners of their intention to do so. February 1st, 1922. Getting more serious now. So the hospital board then is asking for bids for the construction of the hospital. Continuing on. And they're to be let on March 22nd, 1922. That's the day the bids were let. And then continuing, summarize this. George Price Logansport, with a bid of just over $65,000, was awarded the general contract. Also awarded was a contract for plumbing and heating. And the total of just over 76,000 was noted as being significantly less than the estimates, but there's still a need for some equipment and furnishings for the comfort of the patients. Also noted that the hospital board will not use a State Farm brick. I'm not real sure why. They thought it was an inferior product, I believe. So this is March 1922. Just a little bit after that, they decided they would use brick from Brazil, specifically noted as being tobacco brown, rough texture was the style of brick. Continuing. Now we're going. March 13th, 1922. I never could find where they had the official groundbreaking. I would have thought there would have been a picture of the hospital board with their shovels or something, but I could not find anything. But here we got notice that the work is starting. It's in March 1922. In just a little over a year, July of 1923, the hospital board has met to accept the hospital by virtue of the word of Boland and Son, the architects, feel that it's successfully completed. Arrangements are made, equipment's mostly installed, and then in short time, the hospital will be ready to receive patients. Pause if you'd like, continuing on. It's July 11th. July 30th, 1923, they have an open house where 1,800 people inspected the hospital, building, and equipment, and the up-to-date equipment in the building. And they anticipate patients arriving August 1st, Now, if you want to read that whole article, you can. I summarized parts of it. I thought it would be interesting because maybe some of you were never in that hospital. I was born in that building, and I was there various times. When I was 7, Doc Beach from Bainbridge yanked my tonsils out. I had various other procedures done, and so forth, so on. So I was very acquainted with that building. But if you're not, then I describe it to you. One of the reporters went through and said, had 43 beds. On the main floor was the office, the reception room, the patient's visitors room, the kitchen x-ray room, and also noted that Mr. and Mrs. Orson Shirley be in charge of the general work of the hospital on the first floor. The boiler room, supply rooms, also on the main floor, as were the nurses' quarters, which are intended to be temporary. Hopefully a new nurses' home would be erected within the subsequent year across the street west of the hospital. Site already been selected. Now on the second floor were a number of private rooms, one 3-bed ward, kitchen, service room, shower, bath, and then the sun parlor. Many of you have been there, remember the atrium type lounge at the north end of the second floor. Each room furnished with steel beds, walnut dressers, and chairs. And also noted the ambulance entrance is on the west side. It's on the second floor because the lay of the land. There's a fairly steep hill there, and in the west side, the ambulance would come in on the second floor. And the third floor is the operating room and so forth, as well as the nursery, and some more private rooms, linen, the OB, some smaller rooms, and baths was on the third floor. Continuing, pause if you'd like. The hospital staff consisted of Miss Eva Milburn of Lebanon, a graduate of the Methodist Hospital in Minneapolis, Minnesota, was the superintendent. And then Miss Effie Stiegelman, I'm hoping I pronounced that right, also a graduate of the Methodist Hospital of Minneapolis, Minnesota, as assistant superintendent. And then Miss Holbrook, Miss Allen, both graduates of Wesley Hospital in Chicago, were in charge of the night nurse work and the X-ray department, respectively. And here it is. This is a stunning photo, in my opinion. Courtesy Putnam County Public Library. Shows the new hospital. This is on the hill across the street, across from Hillside, looking west. The hospital is in the middle of nowhere. There's only one other house in the area. There's nothing else there. Middle of nowhere. Very beautiful picture. August 1st, sure enough, there's 2 patients as predicted. Had 2 operations scheduled. We'll talk about those. Mrs. Maud Bias Beaver, who resided east of Greencastle near Mount Meridian, was the first patient who underwent an operation performed by Dr. Lemon of Coatesville, and Dr. McGoy was in charge of the anesthetic. The first patient, first surgery, was also one of the first deaths. Mrs. Beaver, wife of Alvin Beaver, passed away in the hospital August 22nd. Just 3 weeks later, she had been readmitted and had been in the hospital for 4 days when she died. Second patient, Miss Luella Broadstreet of Cloverdale, scheduled to undergo an abdominal surgery the following morning. And I did some more research because I was just curious. Found that she lived until November of that year. And then the first week, they were very busy. They'd had 9 cases of tonsils being removed, and then 10 more scheduled for that Friday. So they were very busy pulling out tonsils right away. Pause if you like. And also, some of the benefits of having this hospital were readily apparent. In the first month, Miss Opal Frank of Clinton Township had fallen off her horse, had a severe injury, but they thought that it was not going to be serious. So, typical of the day, they decided, let's see if nature will take its course and heal itself. The human body is wonderful. It will heal itself in some cases. But in this case, that was not going to happen. They decided they would finally bring her in and use this advanced X-ray machine to see what the issue was. Found that she had a fracture of her right arm and her shoulder was dislocated because they had delayed so long. They had to take her to Methodist in Indianapolis. It's just interesting because they used an X-ray machine right away. I was very impressed with that. This story came up in research, only minimal related to the hospital, and that this patient was sent to the new hospital. Then it seems that this 18-year-old woman and her escort, who's 19, from Lebanon and Danville respectively, were driving and then apparently lost control of their Ford car. And it went into some water. They didn't really say how much water. I got the impression it was not deep water, but the young man was trapped under the car and could not get out. So the young lady, very heroically, was able to lift the car up enough the young man could get out. Of course, we're not talking about the heavy cars we have now, but still, it was a very impressive feat, I thought. I wanted to share it. The accident occurred that Monday evening at the Big Ford Railway Arch on the Northeast Road, about 2 miles from Greencastle. A little confused. We're talking about the Big Ford Arch. Continuing. Also, we know the first baby. Hospital had been open 6 months before he had the first child. Apparently, parents thought that they were happy still delivering the children at home or at the local doctor's office. So Mr. and Mrs. Thorngren, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, had a little boy, and the mother and the son were doing fine. Continuing. This is another very nice photo, courtesy of the Putnam County Public Library, obviously mothers and children. The note says, the paper noted it was 1925, this little inscription says 1929, but we don't need to argue that point. This velvet photo, but also in the back left, that's Miss Eva Milburn, the superintendent of the hospital, who apparently ran the hospital very efficiently. And then the assistant, Miss Effie Stiegelman, beside her. Now, if you want to go to the Putnam County Library's website or go to the building, There's a description of who many of these people are. I'm not going to do that here, but you can go check that out if you'd like, if you're curious. Continuing. I only included this article to show you who some of the prominent physicians were practicing in Putnam County at the time. If you pause if you'd like to read the whole thing, but the main point is to show that these doctors, Dr. Mosier of Bell Union, Kahn of Ambridge, C.C. Collins, and Dr. Strobe of Rochdale, so forth and so on, Dr. Clint McGoy, Dr. Walter Hutchison, or Dr. Clint Zering, excuse me, and Dr. McGoy, Dr. George Benz, who had offered his facility for the hospital originally, and then also Miss Melbourne, Miss Eagleman, and several other nurses were there at that dinner. Again, pause if you'd like to read it, or you can go to the Hoosier Chronicles and just find it and read it if you'd like. Greencastle Herald, October 24th, 1923. Okay, so after successfully meeting the medical needs of the hospital for over a decade, it was noted the promised nurses' quarter had never been erected. So now we're jumping forward to the mid-30s, and something needs to be done. And also, the hospital board thinks that you need to have a new heating and laundry plant, a new wing for the hospital. Two separate projects, but they discussed those at the same time initially. There's a little bit of confusion about this. We're going to clarify this. So Dr. and Mrs. Walter Hutchison stepped forward and decided that they would fund the nurses' home themselves. Dr. Hutchison was the nephew of Dr. Benz, the one that originally had offered the hospital 20 years prior. He and his wife both knew the value of the hardworking, dedicated nurses and felt the separate home for them was long overdue. So he committed $20,000 to build this new nurses' home. Dr. Hutchison and Mrs. Hutchison, bless their hearts. But no sooner did they get started in the spring of 1937, they were forced to stop. Some labor union men came and demanded some threats, or demanded some concessions, and hinted at violence. So let's talk about that on the next slide. There's 3 or 4 union men from Terre Haute came and met with Dr. Hutchison and threatened him if they did not use their union labor. But the local union members, the local people working on the nurses' home, said that those union men from Terre Haute did not represent them, and they did not use such extortion. But Dr. Hutchison sent the workers home for the day, had all the materials moved off site that afternoon. The county, realizing the urgency of the situation, decided that they would do an additional appropriation to provide additional deputies to guard the hospital construction work. Again, we're talking April 1937. Which they did. And I don't know if they guarded the workmen every day, but I know they were there at least initially every day. And then by the end of September, it was completed, all but a little bit of trim work, almost ready to move in at the end of September 1937. Pause to read it if you'd like. This is a not very good quality photo. As you know, when they scan some of these newspapers, they bleed through and it doesn't always come through. But this is actually a 1941 article where they're reminiscing in connection with National Nurses Day, noting that the nurses' home was constructed and opened October of 1937. There's a lot of confusion about this date. It's October of 1937. That's when the nurses' home opened. This is what it looks like now. They're using it for apartments. This is a recent photo. And then above the doorway, you can still see the Hutchison Nurses Home. Again, that's still there. It's a recent photo. 1939, 2 years later, the wing is completed. And one of the reasons it took so long to complete the wing the Public Works Administration provided federal funding for this project. So, of course, the red tape and so forth and so on, it's just going to take a little longer. But we'll take it because the feds offered some serious money for this project. But these two get confused. Again, the nurses' home was opened in 1937 and the wing in 1939. Make sure we keep that straight going forward. And this is just a really low quality photo on October 30th, 1939. It's almost impossible to read. If you'd like to pause it, read it, you can go to this newspaper itself. It'll be better quality than what I've got here. Pause if you like. I'm going forward. Then the hospital wing opened that Sunday. Many visited the new addition, as well as other parts of the building during that day, October 30th, 1939. This is a really neat photo, the Putnam County Public Library, of an ambulance at the ambulance entrance on the west side of the hospital. The ambulance entrance is on the second floor because of the hillside and the levee land. And you may not know this, but back in the day, the funeral home directors would transport patients to the hospital in their ambulance and hearse. And I'm almost certain, if you zoom in on this, almost certain that says Hopkins Rector. I'm not sure, but I know it's one of the funeral homes. And in the 1970s, I believe, the state told the health officials they need to quit doing that. They need to quit having the funeral home transport patients, and that practice discontinued. So that was interesting. All right, we go another 20 years, and then we need to add a new wing to the hospital, 1957. Bids were opened for the additional wing at just over $500,000 for that addition. Photo of it, the Daily Banner, May 30th, 1958. Not a very good quality photo. If you'd like to pause and read or go to that newspaper, you can see what it looked like. Continuing. Another 20 years went by, and we've outgrown this hospital, but by now it wasn't in the middle of nowhere. It was surrounded by homes and offices, and there's really literally no room to expand. Plus, we needed to update with newer equipment and newer facilities. So the county commissioners decided they would build a new hospital south of Greencastle. It's in the banner graphic, March 9th, 1979, showing the last child born in the old hospital on March the 4th of that year, and the first child in the new hospital, March the 6th of 1979. This was provided courtesy of Dr. Warren Macy, who delivered both of these children. Very nice photo. I'm pretty sure this is Putnam County Public Library. I noted these were doctors right away, and we're sure it was the old Trail Inn. And after we found out who some of the doctors were, we determined this was about 1950, but I immediately recognized Dr. Ann Nichols. I asked Jinsey Bingham if she would know, and she said, of course she would. So she had some of her friends sit with her, and they went down. We'll go to the next slide here. This is 2 slides, so we're going to go through both of them. And the left, the older gentleman, is Dr. Walter Hudson, the one that funded, with his wife, the nurses' facility. Bless his heart. They didn't know who this one was, but he looks familiar to me, and I can't place him. Dr. Gibray, and then, of course, Dr. Ann Nichols. Continuing then, we have Dr. Tippin, Charles Aker, George Parker, Dr. Johnson, Wiseman, and Dr. Schauacker, all 3 of whom did something to me at some point in time, because this picture, I would have recognized him to be 20 years later, of course. That's why I did not notice him right away. Continuing on, pause if you'd like. Down the back row, they did not recognize who these 2 doctors were, but they were almost certain this was Dr. Lester Veach, from Bainbridge, and I certainly did not remember Dr. Reese like this, because again, this was almost 10 years before I was born. And then Dr. Fusen. Now, we did some research, and we find other doctors who were practicing in the greenhouse area at that time were Dr. George Tennis and Dick Steele. And then also was noted that Dr. Frederick Datloff, if I'm pronouncing that right, was specifically not in this picture. I don't know why that was known. So that may be some of the unknown doctors. Very nice photo. I thought that was great. This is a photo of the hospital now. I took this photo standing about the point where that other panoramic type photo was taken, only at the bottom of the hill, because there are houses there now on that hill. Now used for apartment buildings. And you can see above the doorway, it still says Putnam County Hospital. So I hope you've enjoyed finding out a little bit about the first Putnam County Hospital. I hope you return. We'll talk about some more of early history of Putnam County. Thank you.